Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them in this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. CHEO also honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. With that, I'm delighted to present introduce our presenter for this morning, Dr. Virginie Cobigo. She is an associate professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. She holds a research chair in child and youth mental health at the CHEO Research Institute, and she is founding director of the Open Collaboration for Cognitive Accessibility. Virginie is an award-winning researcher and international leader in the promotion of social inclusion for persons with cognitive disabilities. She leads research and evidence-based practices in sectors supporting persons with cognitive disabilities and encompasses 3 streams: examining how to best support the social inclusion of people with cognitive disabilities and monitoring social inclusion barriers and facilitators, developing and testing solutions for the cognitive accessibility of our environment, and fostering inclusive research approaches. This morning, she's going to be speaking to us about the art of inclusive research. I love that title. ART stands for Accessibility, Autonomy, and Reciprocity and Trust. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Cobigo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here this morning that early. I hope your coffee is good. And I will try to be as energetic as possible to keep you awake. I'm delighted today to be presenting about inclusive research and sharing with you some of the lessons I have learned in the past year. But I really want, and you will see that I really want this presentation this morning to be a conversation. I have built enough time at the end for your comments, your questions, and also your lessons learned, because you will see that I do not pretend that I have learned everything and know how to do inclusive research. I just want to contribute to the conversation about this important topic. So before I start, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of my colleagues. At least one of them is here this morning, Golnaz Gaderi. Golnaz is my PhD student and at the School of Psychology in clinical psychology. This presentation is also informed by the work that Peter Milley from the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa and the director of the Center for Research on Educational and Community Services at the University of Ottawa, and Rosemary Lysite, my colleague from the School of Rehabilitation Therapy at Queen's University. The 3 of them have informed the content of this presentation. So I thought that for this morning, we could have 2 learning objectives. One is to perhaps better understand the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion in research, and specifically in research with persons with cognitive disabilities. And the second objective would be to best understand or to understand better best practices in inclusive research with persons with cognitive disabilities. So cognitive disabilities is my area of research, but I think most of the tips and lessons learned I'm going to share this morning with you are applicable, transferable to many other populations. So I thought that before jumping in the lessons I have learned in the past years, I thought that it would be good to remind ourselves of the definitions of equity, diversity, and inclusion in research. I find that we are lumping them up in an acronym, and we forget their meaning, their individual meaning. Each of these words are full of meaning and important lessons to remind ourselves. So I thought we would start with that. And the definitions I have chosen are the definitions that are in the Guide to Addressing EDI Consideration in Partnership Grant from SSHRC. But there are others, of course. So first, equity. Well, equity is to be understood as fairness. fairness in processes, resource allocation, and decision-making. So it's about treating people with a diversity of identity with fairness. Fairness in our decision-making regarding how we do research, regarding how we allocate resources in the research team, how we also allocate resources, make decisions to make sure that anyone can benefit from the research or participate meaningfully in the research in an equitable way. So equity is a lot of things. And we can better understand equity and act to have an equitable research process if we are aware, knowledgeable on the systemic barriers and biases that we can observe in research and have observed in the past in research as well. So the historical systemic barriers are important to understand, especially for the populations that are concerned by the research we lead. And with that understanding, researchers are in a better position to develop and put in place the right actions to remove those systemic barriers, or at least some of them. Diversity is different. Diversity is about the differences in perspectives and in lived experiences that we bring in research. And this diversity is fundamental to achieving research excellence as well as training excellence. Research excellence, because if we have a better sample, if we have a better representation of the different identities, perspectives, lived experiences that are concerned by the research topic, the research object, then of course our understanding of the issues will be better, our findings or results will be more impactful. And in terms of the training excellence, well, it's about making sure that our trainees are diverse and come with that diversity of perspectives and lived experiences. But it is also about training future leaders, future researchers in understanding diversity and being able to work in a diverse workplace and research environment. Inclusion is about the practices we put in place to ensure that all individuals are valued and respected for their contribution in research. So if we want to hear about a diversity of lived experiences, we have to make sure that their contribution is respected and valued in that process. And inclusion is only possible if we make sure that the necessary supports are in place for people to contribute meaningfully, feel valued and respected. And I think the lesson in those definitions is that we have to remind ourselves that we are agent of change in making research more inclusive. It's a systemic effort for sure, but we are part of the system. So we have to think of ways to change, transform our practices to be more inclusive, equitable, and to have to benefit from the diversity that we are aiming for. And EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion in research are important in two different aspects of research, in research practice and in research design. So in research practice, it is about the diversity of the team, of the research team, including the trainees. It's about making sure that our work environment, our research environment is equitable, inclusive, and accessible to all. And it's about highlighting, fostering diversity, equity in mentoring, in training, and access to development opportunities for team members. the topic for today's presentation is not research practice, it's research design. And EDI in research design is about using different approaches to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these approaches are intersectionality, gender-based analysis plus, and others, to again attract, welcome, value the diversity of perspectives, lived experiences, and knowledge that make the research outputs as excellent as possible. And I would like to argue that although it's not in the list, inclusive research is another approach for fostering EDI in research design, also in research practice, but again, today we'll talk about research design. And inclusive research is it's an approach where we apply research methods and we transform research methods and processes to be as accessible, equitable, and inclusive as possible. And the idea is that by making our own methods and processes inclusive, we are going to capture a diverse perspective. We are going to capture diverse perspectives and lived experiences because we welcome those differences and that diversity in our research design. And in inclusive research, we welcome this diversity in different roles. So the persons we try to engage in research have a role that goes beyond the role of the passive participants that we have seen in traditional research. And there are different roles that are possible, from co-researchers, co-trainers to advisors. There is a variety of different roles. But the idea you will see is that in inclusive research, we try to share the decision power of the research process and the research methods to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible. And inclusive research is known to have many benefits. There are benefits for the academic researchers, of course. And among those benefits is the excellence of the research, the capacity to capture a more diverse understanding of an issue. So we learn differently, we learn different things, we contribute to knowledge in a different way than traditionally without using inclusive research approaches. But there are also benefits to the persons we welcome to contribute to research, who might be co-researchers or contribute to the research design and research decision-making. And these people tend to report high satisfaction in the process, and they say that they learned a lot, they felt empowered when contributing to research and learning from research. They report a sense of accomplishment, and some of them also report an increased support system around them. So it has benefits for those we involve, and for the participants in the research, they also report benefits. Benefits in how they relate to the research team, because the research team is diverse and they can relate to someone who has similar lived experiences to them. So they feel more welcome, they feel more safe in the research environment when we use an inclusive research approach. So now, as I said, I would like this morning to share some lessons learned from the past years in conducting inclusive research with persons with cognitive disabilities. First of all, I would like to precise who I'm talking about when I mention the word cognitive disability. It's a very messy concept. It's not well defined. But the way I understand cognitive disability, and of course I'm not the only one, but the definition I use for cognitive disabilities is that the persons have limitations in one or more domains of cognitive functioning that would include attention, executive functions, learning and memory, language, perceptual motor skills, and social cognitions. There are lots of different conditions that are associated with cognitive disabilities. This list is absolutely not exhaustive, but of course there is intellectual and developmental disabilities, ADHD, learning disabilities, and brain dysfunctions associated with concussion, epilepsy, stroke, or dementia. And I have chosen those examples of conditions to reflect the fact that it's a lifelong experience for some of them, but not all of them. Many of us will live with cognitive disability as we age, and the prevalence of cognitive disabilities increase significantly in older age groups. But for kids and youth with cognitive disabilities, it is a lifelong experience, and making the world in general more accessible, but also research more accessible and inclusive makes a huge difference in how we can work with them. So inclusive research, as I said, has many benefits that have been reported in research, but we also know there are many barriers to inclusive research. It is really hard to do. One of the barrier is the difficulty in recruiting the persons we want to welcome in our research team and as participants. It would be very naive of us to think that we can recruit easily persons who have traditionally been excluded from research, had never contributed to research, and even worse, who were the subject of abusive situations from researchers in the past. So it would be very naive to think it is easy. So the first barrier is really to find those people who want to contribute to research. So that's the first barrier, and I'm going to talk about later how I try to overcome this barrier. Consent is reported as a significant barrier to inclusive research. Consent from individuals with cognitive disabilities or underrepresented group. The difficulties around consent are about the facility to consent to something we had never experienced before. So there are questions around the consent, the informed consent of individuals who have never been exposed to research, have never contributed to research, and how can they really understand what contribution they have to make. But most of the barriers around consent are actually misconceptions from researchers. And when we adapt, and I will tell you later how in my team we have approached these issues, when we adapt our processes, we can make free and informed consent easier for the persons we wish to involve in research. Among other barriers to inclusive research are the additional resources that are required to conduct inclusive research, and I would include in resources time. It takes time, it's a bit longer, it's a slower process, and it's not always well recognized by funded agencies. So that is a struggle as well for researchers. There is also a lack of training and tools for researchers to know how to work with persons with cognitive disabilities or more broadly underrepresented groups. We all want to do it. We are very committed to EDI in research, but we don't necessarily know how. And it's the same for persons with cognitive disabilities or persons who are members of underrepresented groups. It is difficult sometimes for them to understand their role in research. Because again, they have never done it. Most of them never went to university. So it's there is a need for training and tools to support that involvement. Accessibility is a huge barrier to research. Members from underrepresented groups and specifically persons with cognitive disabilities will say that they don't understand research. They don't even understand our recruitment material. So the complexity of the research material and the research processes is an important barrier to inclusive research. And I would argue that all of these barriers could be overcome if we build the evidence to inform best practices. I think that what is critically missing is the evidence to help us develop practices that work and be confident in the way we involve members of underrepresented groups. So that's my objective for today. It's really to contribute to evidence by sharing the lessons we have learned in the past years. It is based on a literature review that we are conducting on inclusive research methods with persons with cognitive disabilities. So learning from other researchers, but also an evaluation of our own practices. And again, that work was led by Golnaz, Peter, and Rosemary. So this is why I have created recently a social enterprise, which is called Open Collaboration for Cognitive Accessibility. I basically started my reflection on a few assumptions. One is that we need to transform our research methods and processes to be inclusive. We cannot keep going and do the same things we have done in the past and dream for an inclusive approach to research. We have to change the way we work. And we have to change the way we work to make our methods and processes accessible. Another assumption was that we can only achieve inclusive research and transform research to be more inclusive and equitable if we are able to shift at least a part of the power, the decision-making power in research. If we continue to be the only decision makers at the table, we meaning researchers, then it's very unlikely that our processes, methods, and research environments will be made accessible, welcoming, inclusive. A third assumption was that inclusive research is inspired by social justice. We want inclusive approaches, we want EDI in research because we want to tackle a social justice issue. And so we have to understand what in the issues we are studying are relevant to the groups we want to involve in research. How does it relate to their lived experiences and what difference can it make in their own lives or advocacy efforts? And we must also transform our knowledge mobilization activities. That's part of the research process, obviously. And we need to change that in a way that, that empowers persons with cognitive disabilities or other underrepresented groups. We have to make sure that in that process, we give them the knowledge they were looking for in the research. So these were the assumptions I was working with, and funded by the inaugural competition of the New Frontiers in Research Fund, I hypothesized that social entrepreneurship might be a mean to achieve that transformation or to support that transformation. So that's why I have created open collaboration for cognitive accessibility. I hypothesized that by creating a social enterprise, because a social enterprise is a business, it attracts contracts, sells services or products, but it is social because it has a social mission, it has a social purpose. So that's the main difference. And by making explicit that social mission or purpose, I thought that maybe that would be a way to make a social contract more explicit with the persons I wanted to engage in my research. I also thought that entrepreneurship would be more agile, more flexible, and faster than traditional research environments to support knowledge mobilization. So I had a few of those assumptions, and with the New Frontiers Fund, I conducted a feasibility study of the social enterprise I have created. And we have been in activities for a bit more than a year. And we are now a relatively successful startup for a one-year existence. Since 2019, we have attracted more than $400,000 in contracts and research funding, which in social sciences is good. Some neurosciences or engineering or other colleagues might not see that amount as important, but in social sciences it is quite respectable. In 22, so since January, we have already surpassed the revenues we made last year. Contracts are coming in, and we have been able to offer employment to about 30 individuals with cognitive disabilities to be involved in research and innovation led by academic researchers or the private industry. And these individuals are aged 9 to 80 and have a range of cognitive abilities. So it seems to be working, but Rosemary, Peter, and Golnaz did a thorough evaluation of our work, and we learned from that what seems to be working, what seems to be not working as planned as well. So I will try to share some of those lessons with you today. So the first lesson is around accessibility. As I said, the complexity of research processes and methods is a major barrier to inclusive research. As researchers, we are not trained in accessibility requirements and best practices. So I think one of the first lessons I learned is that it is very important when we want to build inclusive approaches in our projects, to have a budget line for accessibility and to make sure that our research material, knowledge mobilization outputs are made as accessible as possible. It is also important in building accessibility in research to understand the possible accommodation needs from the persons we want to involve in research. What would make research more accessible to them? We need to plan that ahead of time rather than trying to scramble and make things accessible afterwards. And it is also important to understand their strengths. What are the strengths? What is the knowledge that they have and that we want? We really have to be careful in research because we tend to have that ableist approach where we know, but it would be really nice to have that added value by bringing in their perspectives and lived experiences. And I think we need to think in a different way. They know something we really don't know. We really need them to bring that knowledge to us. And that's a very different perspective when we think that way. So things we have done in my team, and again, I'm not the only one, there are other researchers internationally doing similar things, is that we have, we try to develop all of our recruitment material, consent forms, data collection material with accessibility best practices in mind, including easy read. So easy read is a step further from plain language. It's really making sure that our texts are as easy to understand and read as possible. And there are guidelines, there are tips to write that way. So we do that, and we have collaborated with the Research Ethics Board at the University of Ottawa to make sure that our consent forms and recruitment material had the information that was critical, but was still accessible, which was a process for the Research Ethics Board, because of course there were informations that we needed to remove from those documents. For example, our consent forms and recruitment material tend to have way too many phone numbers. There is a phone number to contact the research lead. There is a phone number to contact the research team. There is a phone number to contact the ethics board. And these phone numbers usually have an extension attached. And in terms of accessibility, that is really, really bad. So we agreed on 2 phone numbers. That's it. One for ethics and one for the research team, but no other phone numbers appear on any of our documents to simplify things. And the number for the research team is a 1-800 number, which is a direct phone line to the research team, no extension. And I learned that when a phone call from a participant was transferred to my office from the registrar office at the University of Ottawa. So the person was completely lost in our phone system and couldn't connect with the research team. So anyway, that's a simple tip. We also allow for multiple ways of collecting data. So in research, as researchers, we tend to decide on the best data collection method for us, the one that is the most feasible for us and also will lead to the best data we can. But for accessibility purposes, it's better to allow for different ways of contributing or participating to research. And usually with the persons we want to involve in research, interviews are the best method because it allows us to accommodate the individual, to explain, to rephrase, to offer probes, etc. But for some individuals, for example, persons with autism, they would prefer to respond to a questionnaire or do the interview by email. And we allow that to make sure that our processes are as accessible as possible. It is also important to consider the role of support persons in the research process. So we let our participants know that they can be accompanied by someone they trust, which they often appreciate. But we have learned that it is very important to make sure this person understands their role. So they sign an agreement where they understand they're here to support the communication and make the person comfortable. But they are not the participants, so we don't want them to interfere with the responses. And we also ask them to sign a confidentiality agreement because being part of the research process, they might learn privileged information about the person they would not know without the research project. So it's very important they understand that as well. And from the evaluation, we our advisors, we call them advisors, the persons with cognitive disabilities we involve, they all reported high satisfaction in our processes and really appreciated the efforts we have made to accommodate them and make the processes as accessible as possible. With one participant saying, for example, or advisor, he's not a participant, he's an advisor, saying it was perfect, the documentation, it was perfect, clear, I understood my role well. So I think that we do a good job at. The second principle that I wanted to share with you is autonomy. So autonomy is the right to make your own decision. It's your free will. And so it relates a lot to the notion of consent, of free and informed consent in research. In my team, but it's also the position of many international researchers, including colleagues from the UK who have led the ASCENT research project that led to the development of resources and reports that are available online. I can share that with you if you're interested. But basically, the position is that evaluating or determining capacity to consent in research is a violation of human rights. Consent is to be understood in a context. So we don't have a capacity to consent to everything. It's our capacity to consent to the specific context we are interested in. And it's a process rather than a one-time interaction. And free and informed consent rely on our obligation as researchers to make the materials, the information accessible and useful to the persons we want to involve in research. There are researchers who disagree. There are many researchers who assess capacity to consent. There is a debate, but my position is that as a researcher, I assume they can consent to research. However, I have to make sure that they do indeed consent to contribute to research in the way that we invite them to contribute, and that they understand the benefits and the potential negative consequences of their participation. So we understand consent again as a process. We first make sure that they have the information they need to understand the invitation, and that information has to be accessible. We also allow them for time to consult with someone they trust. And the consent is something we verify throughout the process at each interaction with them. We make sure that we are aware, and my research staff are trained in identifying signs of discomforts that might be a sign that we need to reconfirm consent. We also have a process where we check if the person has understood their rights in research, the benefits to their research, the possible negative consequences, etc. So we have a questionnaire that we use for individuals to, for us to make sure that the individuals understand the invitation and their rights in research. But autonomy is more than consent to research. It is also a dimension of self-determination. So when we think about autonomy as researchers, it's important that we build in our process ways for persons with cognitive disabilities to influence decision-making in the research process, or even take control of some of the aspects of the research. I personally see this as a continuum. There are different roles that persons can be invited to play throughout the research process, from advisors to co-researchers, and there is a range or continuum that we can use. To me, the most important thing to do is to plan that ahead of time, to really make it part of the research design, and not, again, trying to make our inclusive research approach fit aftermath. So to me, that's really critical to strategically decide when, how the persons we want to involve in research are going to contribute to research and make their decision power explicit in the research process. And it's also about the ownership of the research findings and outputs. If we want the persons we involve in research to own the research, again, we have to think of what in the research is relevant to them, what is useful to them, how it can inform their lived experiences or advocacy efforts. And we have to make sure that the outputs of the research serve that purpose, so they can really own that piece of the research and use it. Which is good, because then as researchers, we can demonstrate greater impact of our research. So we also benefit from that. Reciprocity, to me, is a critical principle. It is about the authenticity of our relationship. If we want to have inclusive approaches, I strongly believe that we have to be genuine in our intentions. And we have to be willing, interested in learning from their lived experiences and learn from their input in research design and practices. Without this, inclusive research is tokenism. We just make sure that there are people representing certain groups in pieces of the project, but they don't have that true contribution to research. So that's probably a question of changing attitudes, sometimes changing our mindset and being receptive to their knowledge and recognizing them as experts in that knowledge. Again, they're bringing something we do not know, so we need their expertise. Reciprocity, to me, is also about the benefits to research. So when we design research, we have to make sure that, of course, we're going to benefit from it. We need to publish papers, we need to contribute to knowledge, we need to do all that. But what in that is relevant to the persons we want to involve? In the evaluation that my colleagues have led, our advisors report learning. They learned new skills. They grew inside. To me, that's a demonstration of reciprocity, because we have learned a lot. They have learned as well. So we have been true partners in that process. And finally, trust is the last principle I wanted to illustrate in this presentation. And trust is critical when we want to work with members of underrepresented group, because they don't trust researchers for good reasons. They have evidence that we are not always well-intentioned. The way I was working before was through advocacy groups or trusted organization that would help me recruit participants or advisors. And I still do that. It's very effective and useful, and it helps build that trust. But it has the problem is the gatekeeper issue, where they only recruit persons who they think will be interested, might have the least negative consequences in the research. So it introduces many biases to the research. And with Open, I have been able to expand on that pool and go beyond my traditional network of trusted agencies and partners. And I think what is critical is the transparency and the accountability. It's because we have been able with the enterprise to show them how their contribution is used and what difference it makes. And I believe, I don't know, that this has been important in building trust. I thought that making explicit the social contract would be a key factor in building trust, but from the evaluation, I gathered that it's actually important for the community partners, the organizations, to understand the social purpose of the organization, but advisors with cognitive disabilities don't quite understand what Open is about and what is our social contract and mission. So that might not be the key. However, a key to building trust is the fact that they are paid for their contribution, and recognizing their contribution with an honorarium, not just a gift card, makes a huge difference in how they trust us and want to contribute to our work. I see the time, and I really want to keep some time for questions and discussion. So as a conclusion, I would like to invite you to contribute to inclusive research approaches and think about ways you can or already have transformed your research methods and processes to be more inclusive and accessible. To me, this is a moral and ethical obligation from researchers. We must be reminded that among the evidence that led to our ethical principles guiding research, including the Belmont Report, etc., among the evidence was evidence of human rights violations against persons with cognitive disabilities by researchers. So I think that being accountable to them is a moral and ethical obligation. But that's my personal perspective. So again, with that in mind, I hope that I helped you think about a few tips and maybe reflect on your own practices. And I would love to have a conversation with the few minutes we have left about that topic with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, that was wonderful. Thank you, Virginie. It was a really great presentation and overview of really the key principles about Open as you have defined it. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. You've left us a good amount of time for discussion. And I just want to invite everyone to either put their question in the chat, or they can raise their hand, or they can just start speaking if they have a question or a comment for our speaker. And as you were going through all of those different issues, it made me wonder. I'm not sure if you are actually officially a resource for our researchers, or whether that is something that you are looking to promote. It certainly sounds like you would be a tremendous resource for issues that are really important to so many different types of research that our researchers are engaged in. So I wonder if you could speak to that first.
Yeah, sure. So indeed, some researchers have already included a budget line for Open when it is relevant to their research projects, to support, for example, the adaptation of their consent forms, recruitment material, data collection material in Easy Read, but also to inform knowledge mobilization. All my PhD students have 2 advisors with cognitive disabilities informing their theses as well. And they connect with us regularly throughout the research process to gain their insight into how to best recruit individuals and how to mobilize knowledge. So that's also another approach, but absolutely contact me if you're interested.
That's great. And it sounds like contact you before the grant goes in, and probably would help with success of the grant as well. So we have a question or a comment from Jason Berman. Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Mona. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Virginie?
Yeah, great.
Thanks for your rounds, really informative and inspiring. And now I think Mona's opened up the floodgates. Hopefully you will get lots of requests. We know that people are thinking about and wanting to and needing to include EDII issues in their research projects. And at the RI, I will plug that we're in the process of developing, we're developing some guidelines, and then looking actually nationally through MyCERN to develop sort of a national resource around how to be as inclusive and equitable in research. And perhaps, as we sort of form a bit of a national group to look at that, Virginie, I think your experience and your insights would be very valuable. My question to you, and this is a bit of a different question, I'm not sure how easy this will be to answer, is that I know you recently came back from sabbatical where you were in France, and I appreciate that it was during the pandemic, so that may have impacted interactions. But I wonder, with that in mind, whether you could provide a bit of a global perspective in terms of how this is addressed. Maybe, I know it was just France, but in Europe versus in North America, because I think most of our perspective around this is North American, and I wonder if it's the same overseas or whether you saw some differences.
There are a lot of commonalities, and the literature review we are doing right now informs my response to your question. The approach of accessibility, consent, that is an international consensus in my field. There are certainly lots of commonalities. UK researchers are leading in that regard. The Netherlands are also very impressive in their inclusive approach. Australia as well is among the leaders. But no one has found the way to do it, and really the lack of evidence is concerning to me, because we invent things to do, but we actually don't measure the impact of our changes. So not learning from evidence-based practices, I believe. But anyway, in France, the addition that I find very interesting, and in Quebec they have some interest as well on that notion, is the notion of père aidance. I don't know the translation in English, but the idea is that there is better empathy and there is better connection when you relate to someone who has similar lived experiences. And that helps with the support group around you. So they build a lot of their inclusive approaches around père aidance. So that is probably an interesting contribution from the French community.
I don't see any other questions right now, but I do have another question for you, if you will, or if I may. I'm wondering if for research studies that take place over a period of time, if there is a change in an individual's cognitive ability, how that is reassessed, or is it reassessed over the course of a research study? Is there a reconsenting procedure? You kind of talked about it in your discussion, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more, either if their cognitive ability improves or declines, how that impacts the consenting and ongoing consenting procedure.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it has to be thought through as we design the research project, because there might be some specificities of each of the research project. But as I said, consent should be understood as a process. So each interaction with the individual should be an opportunity to gauge their connection, interest, discomfort with the research process and addressing it. If you observe discomfort, maybe it's just fatigue and you need to have a break, but maybe they're telling you that they are uncomfortable with the question or the research process or whatever. So I think understanding consent as a process, taking any interaction as an opportunity to confirm or not consent is very important in our approach.
Great.
There are ways, there are tools, I mean, to measure cognitive abilities as well that are used mainly in dementia. The research community working with persons with dementia often builds assessment of cognitive abilities in their design, when in intellectual disability, we never do that. So there are also cultural differences, I think, depending on your discipline or your research interests.
Right. So those tools probably wouldn't necessarily translate into, tools for dementia wouldn't translate to patients in our population, for example.
Probably not. And I personally question it. Like, it's not because your tool observed a decline in cognitive abilities that their understanding of the research and their willingness to contribute has changed. So I think we have to be very careful about how we interpret those changes in cognitive abilities as it relates to research.
Right.
And it depends on the research as well. I mean, the stakes are not as high if your research is about understanding, I don't know what I could say, understanding how to improve education regarding how to tie your shoes compared to a medical intervention. So we also have to understand what are the implications of the research projects in terms of the impact on the individual as well.
Right. And that there is a question that just came up in the chat that it maybe touches on this issue. The comment in question is, researchers who want to adopt EDI in their research occasionally encounter, I would say probably more than occasionally, encounter challenges with REB. Any thoughts on how to address this?
Always a lot. I have worked very closely with the director of the Research Ethics Board, with whom I have interacted, to explain things. And at the beginning of my career at the University of Ottawa, I had questions about capacity to consent, but also a lot of protection from the REB that is a violation of human rights. And when I was bringing up the legislative framework around my decisions for informing my research design, or international work like the Ascent project and others, then the REB was okay with the way I was proceeding. I think education is very key. Like, we cannot expect our colleagues on the REB to know about it all. So education, communication is critical. I have actually published a book chapter on how I have collaborated with the REB at the University of Ottawa on a few of those issues that I can share if you email me.
Okay, that's very helpful. I suspect you may be getting a few calls for assistance from people that are hearing about this round. I think it'd be incredibly helpful because I think we need education all the way around to help improve what we're doing. So with that, we are at time. So I wanted to thank you again on behalf of the Department of Pediatrics for sharing your expertise on this. It really does impact so many areas of research, really, for all of us. So thank you again for the work that you're doing and for how you're going to help us going ahead in future.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay, bye, everyone.